My son locked me in my bedroom for 12 hours. When I finally got out, everything changed. This is my story. My name is Estelle Moreno, I'm 62, and last week, my son locked me in the upstairs bedroom for 12 hours during his wedding reception, which was held right downstairs, in the very house I paid for. I hadn't planned on saying anything about it to anyone, but silence sits strangely in your mouth when you've been told your presence is too humiliating to be seen. The funny thing is, I'd spent that whole morning baking, setting out candles, and fussing with the flower arrangements until the scent clung to my clothes like second skin. Jared had always been a private child, cautious with affection, meticulous with appearances, never one to show emotion unless it was carefully curated. As a boy, he used to rearrange his books by color and wipe fingerprints off his toy cars with the corner of his shirt. I used to find it sweet, the way he wanted everything just so. I thought it meant he had standards, a sense of self-respect. But sometimes, when people spend their lives obsessing over appearances, it's not because they want things clean, it's because they want something hidden. The house had been full of noise that morning, vendors rolling in with folding chairs, trays of hors d'oeuvres balanced like sculptures, women in high heels and expensive perfume drifting through the rooms like they own them. I smiled through all of it, grateful to still be standing after a year of medical scares and grief that sat heavy in the corners of the house like forgotten shoes. I wore a navy dress Jared's wife, Camille, had picked out for me herself. She said it was understated, like that was something to be proud of. Just before the ceremony, Jared came upstairs, already in his suit, jaw tight and voice too calm. "Mom," he said, "I need you to stay up here for a little while, just until the guests are settled." I didn't question it, not at first, because mothers learn to swallow confusion before it embarrasses anyone. He kissed my forehead, told me to rest, and when he shut the door behind him, I heard the key turn in the lock like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't realized was being written. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a nervous precaution, maybe a lock that jammed without meaning to. I jiggled the handle gently, called his name once, then sat back down on the edge of the bed, still warm from my body. The sounds of celebration floated through the air vent, laughter, clinking glasses, someone playing a jazz version of At Last on the hired keyboard. I sat there in full makeup, stockings leaving patterns on my thighs, wondering if I had done something wrong, if I had said something that morning that embarrassed him. Time moved like honey dripping down the side of a spoon, slow and golden and sticky with meaning. Every hour, I waited for footsteps, for someone to come tell me the lock was broken, that I was missed. But the hallway remained silent, except for a single moment around 6, when I heard Camille's voice outside the door whisper, "She's still in there," and Jared replied, "Don't worry, it's better this way." That's when I knew it wasn't a mistake, and something inside my chest curled in on itself like old paper catching flame. The room they locked me in used to be Jared's childhood room, the one with glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling in a crooked constellation he once insisted was Pegasus. I had painted the walls seafoam green when he was 8, a calming color, the man at the hardware store said. As I sat there, I could still smell the faintest hint of the lavender sachets I used to keep in his drawers, the same drawers now empty except for a forgotten action figure and a pair of cufflinks I gave him the year he graduated. I didn't cry, not at first. My body knew better than to waste salt on people who don't check locked doors. Instead, I did what I've always done when someone shuts me out. I straightened the room, folded the quilt at the foot of the bed, aligned the shoes by the closet, and waited. By the time the music faded and the house settled into the kind of silence only shame brings, I was sitting perfectly still, dress unwrinkled, hands folded in my lap, and a quiet understanding forming in the pit of my stomach. Some doors don't open from the outside. What Estelle does next will change everything, not just for her son, but for herself. If you want to see how this unfolds, subscribe now so you don't miss Chapter 2. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is just getting started. There was a moment, maybe around hour 4, when I thought about knocking louder, screaming even, but the music downstairs was thick and joyful, the kind that wraps itself around a house and makes walls feel like velvet, not plaster. Through the air vent, I could hear forks scraping plates, someone shouting Jared's name, a round of clapping that must have followed one of those sweet rehearsed speeches people give at weddings to pretend everything that came before wasn't complicated. I heard Camille laugh, that polite laugh she does when she wants people to like her more than she likes herself. What made it worse was knowing exactly what they were saying about me. Jared has always been a revisionist when it comes to his own story, reshaping memories like clay until they're smooth and simple. To the guests, I was probably the estranged mother, the one who'd been unstable for years, who wasn't comfortable in crowds, who preferred solitude to celebration. It's a delicate kind of cruelty to lie about someone in a way that sounds like compassion. That's how they keep people from asking questions. They wrap the truth in something soft and call it protection. I remembered Camille's words from the week before when I asked if I could give a small toast. Maybe let Jared take the lead, she'd said, all gentle eyes and even tone. It might be simpler that way. I'd smiled, of course. I always smile when I'm being erased. It's a reflex at this point. But now I understood the choreography. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a dress rehearsal for my absence. A plan written in small glances and quiet comments. They didn't forget me. They planned around me. The food smelled like rosemary chicken, probably the catering from that trendy place Camille loves, the one with the rustic bread and olives on slate boards. I made her a lemon cake last Christmas and she laughed, told me her family didn't really do desserts with so much sugar. I remember standing at the sink that night, scraping the whole thing into the trash while they watched holiday specials in the other room. I never baked for her again. Not because I was offended, but because I understood some people don't want sweetness from you, they want silence. Around dusk, the music shifted. I could hear the slow song set, the one where everyone starts to cry a little because the wine has softened them just enough to feel human again. Someone gave a toast. I could tell by the change in tone, and Camille's mother's voice carried through the air vent, trembling with admiration. "You've finally broken the cycle," she said. "You've built something better than what you came from." The table must have gone quiet after that. Not because it was awkward, but because everyone knew what she meant. I had become shorthand for dysfunction. There was a time, not so long ago, when Jared and I shared grilled cheese sandwiches in this very room, when I would rub his back until he fell asleep after nightmares about his father leaving. He used to ask me if I'd ever leave him, and I'd promise, again and again, that I never would. What I didn't realize was that some children grow up resenting the people who stay, because presence is proof of their own cowardice. Jared didn't leave me behind. He buried me inside the version of himself that made him look clean. Sometime after dark, the door handle jiggled once, quietly, like someone considered unlocking it, but changed their mind. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I sat in the same spot, in the same dress, with the same ache in my hands I'd had since they started shaking last fall. I thought about my late husband, how he would have paced the kitchen like a storm if he were still alive. He never liked Camille much. Said she looked at people like problems to be solved. But grief has a funny way of making you easy to manipulate, especially when it's old. By the time the house settled into silence, I had memorized the pattern of the wallpaper, the creak in the floorboard near the dresser, the sound my own breath made when I tried not to cry. Outside, I imagined the last guests stumbling to their cars, Jared shaking hands with Camille's father, promising a future that had already been bought with someone else's dignity. And still I didn't weep. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just a party I missed. It was a rehearsal for every other door they would lock behind me, with a smile. I left the house the next morning without making a sound, walked right past the dining room where empty wine glasses still held traces of lipstick, where crumbs of wedding cake clung to porcelain like ghosts. The front steps creaked under my feet, that familiar groan I used to promise I'd fix someday, and I stood there for a moment, just breathing, just being. It wasn't about leaving quietly, it was about not waiting for anyone to notice. I got into my car, hands trembling slightly on the wheel, and drove 3 blocks before the tears finally made their way out. At the lawyer's office, I said the words I never imagined I'd say. I want to revise the will. Mr. Corbin blinked once, adjusted his glasses, and didn't ask why. He had known me for years, drawn up our estate plan after my husband passed, sent a card after Jared's graduation with a note that said, "You raised a good one." I think he saw it in my face, that something had shifted, not in rage, but clarity. I laid out the documents slowly, every deed, every account, every paper trail I had been quietly keeping safe, just in case. The house, technically, was still mine. Jared had moved in after college, said it felt like home, and when Camille followed, I made space for her too, cleared out drawers, gave them the master bedroom, told myself it was temporary, told myself this was how families evolved. But I had never signed it over, had never let go entirely, though he asked me more than once. "It's just paperwork, Mom," he'd say, fingers tapping impatiently on the table. Now I was grateful for every delay, every forgotten errand, every small moment when hesitation became protection I didn't know I'd need. I transferred the savings account out of his reach, called the bank manager by name, and asked her to remove Jared's access. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Moreno?" she asked gently, and I nodded, smiling as though that answer hadn't already fallen apart the night before. She didn't press. Women like us recognize silence when it carries weight. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the DMV updating titles, shredding old authorizations, removing his name from insurance documents one by one. By dusk, I had reclaimed more than just paper. I had taken back every inch he assumed was already his. That night, I opened the small fireproof safe tucked behind the hall closet, the one Jared never noticed because people rarely see what doesn't benefit them. Inside was a folder I hadn't touched in years, one that held every receipt from his tuition, every grocery run when they were just starting out, every time Camille's freelance paycheck came up short and they needed someone to cover the electric bill. I printed copies, neatly highlighted them, attached a short note that said simply, "For your records, since I no longer appear in your stories." Then I placed it in the mailbox. 3 days passed before I heard anything. A voicemail from Camille's father, tight-voiced and clipped. "Estelle, I just received some financial documents from you. I'd appreciate a conversation about what this all means." I didn't call him back. The next day, Jared texted a string of question marks. Then finally, "Why are you doing this?" I stared at the screen until it dimmed, placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went back to scrubbing the sink. It's amazing how many things get clean when your hands need somewhere to go. On the 4th day, Camille came by. She stood on the porch like she was the one who lived here, wearing a coat that still had the store tag tucked into the seam. "He's just been under stress," she said, voice syrupy and slow. "The wedding was a lot. He didn't mean anything by it." I opened the door halfway, not enough to invite her in. "Do you want tea?" I asked. "We still have some of that herbal blend you liked." She hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said, "I just wanted to smooth things over." I nodded politely. She left with nothing in her hands, and I didn't watch her walk to her car. Instead, I turned on the kettle, sliced an apple, and sat at the small table by the window, the one I used to dream over when Jared was still small, his face pressed against the glass waiting for snow. There are moments when something breaks, not with sound, but with stillness, when the absence of apology speaks louder than any door slamming shut. I drank my tea in silence, let it scald my tongue slightly, because some pain, when chosen, is easier to swallow. Camille's mother ran into me at the pharmacy 2 weeks later, near the greeting card aisle where sympathy and congratulations sat shoulder to shoulder like they weren't opposites. She hesitated when she saw me, her hand still on a pack of overpriced gift bags, then offered a tight smile, the kind women use when they're unsure if they're still allowed to be polite. "You've caused quite a stir," she said, her voice clipped, pretending to joke. I nodded once, choosing not to match her tone, and returned to reading the label on a bottle of Tylenol I didn't need. Rumors had begun to ripple, subtle at first, but growing bolder with each passing week. Jared's business partner pulled out of a small development deal after seeing the documents I sent Camille's father, and there were whispers that Jared had been reckless with personal funds. I hadn't said a word to anyone outside those who needed to know, but stories have a way of traveling when the air around them is hungry. At the local bank, The teller asked how my family was, and I simply smiled, signed the check, and let her fill in the blanks herself. I still receive texts from Jared, all variations of confusion and outrage, none with the words I waited for. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't say he missed me, only asked why I was dismantling everything we built. I suppose it never occurred to him that I had hands too, that I was capable of both building and undoing. One morning, he wrote, "What do you even want from me?" And I typed a reply 3 times, deleting each version, before leaving the message unread and setting the phone on top of the fridge where I wouldn't reach for it. At church, during the candlelight service, the pastor spoke about forgiveness in that soft, rehearsed way that makes even grief feel marketable, and I sat in the back pew next to a woman I barely knew, our shoulders not touching, but close enough to feel the heat. When the choir began singing, I remembered how Jared used to fidget with the hem of his little blazer, whispering the wrong lyrics with so much conviction I never corrected him. He used to ask if God could see him even when he was bad, and I would say yes, always yes. The financial unraveling wasn't public, but it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for: calls ignored, appointments missed, credit cards mysteriously declined at brunch. Camille's Instagram shifted from curated perfection to long silences, then vague captions about boundaries and self-worth. A mutual friend mentioned seeing her at the salon, crying quietly while her nails dried, saying something about a mortgage she never signed. I listened without reacting, then went home and opened the living room windows for the first time in months, letting the cold air settle into the cushions like a long overdue guest. I started finding small things in drawers that I had forgotten belonged to me: a bracelet Jared gave me when he was 10, a cookbook I used during holidays before Camille began hosting everything, a photograph of my husband smiling in a way I hadn't remembered until I saw it again. I placed each item on the kitchen shelf like offerings, not to the past, but to the version of myself I had buried in the name of being needed. It's a strange thing to grieve someone who is still alive, still texting, still convinced they've done nothing wrong. One Thursday, I walked past the house, the one Jared still technically lived in, though I knew they'd begun packing, preparing for the move they said was a fresh start. The curtains were half drawn, and the porch light flickered slightly, the same one I'd changed every winter without being asked. A delivery man dropped off a small box at the door and didn't wait for anyone to answer. I paused for a moment, long enough to hear muffled arguing behind the glass, then kept walking, my steps steady, the wind curling around my coat like quiet applause. That evening, Rosa called to invite me to dinner. "Just soup and salad," she said, "nothing fancy," but the kids missed me. I brought a bottle of wine and a tin of shortbread cookies I hadn't made in years, and when her youngest, Ella, wrapped her arms around my waist and said, "You smell like cinnamon," I felt something unstick inside my chest. We ate slowly, unhurried, stories flowing like warm broth, and when Rosa cleared the table, I stayed behind, refolding napkins, smiling at the scrape of chairs and laughter down the hall, like it was a song I remembered the words to. Spring arrived without ceremony, the kind that sneaks in through open windows and lingers in the corners of the house like light spilled from a glass, and I found myself breathing easier, not deeply, but without the tightness that used to sit behind my ribs like folded paper. The mornings were quieter, just birds and kettle whistles and the hum of a neighbor's lawnmower in the distance. I started walking again, the same route Jared and I used to take when he was small and restless, his fingers curled around mine, tugging toward puddles he was always too old to jump into. I passed the community college one afternoon, watched a group of older students laughing beneath a tree, books tucked under their arms, and something about it felt tender, unthreatening, familiar. I walked inside on a whim, spoke to a woman named Sharon at the continuing education desk, and signed up for a class on aging and elder care, figuring if I couldn't fix what happened behind closed doors, I could at least learn how to help others who live with similar silences. The first class smelled like whiteboard markers and nervous energy, and when I introduced myself, my voice didn't shake. By May, I had a routine: mornings in the garden, afternoons at the library, and evenings spent writing letters I never intended to send. One was to Jared, describing the smell of lavender in bloom and how I used to rub his back when he couldn't sleep. Another was to Camille, thanking her for showing me exactly where I stood, even if the lesson came wrapped in velvet cruelty. I kept them in a shoebox under the bed, not out of secrecy, but because some words are meant to be written, not read, especially by the people who inspired them. I saw Jared again in early June, outside the grocery store, paper bags cradled in his arms like shields, and for a second, he looked just like the boy I used to chase around the cereal aisle. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but I stepped aside, held the door open for a woman with a stroller, and walked past him without a word. It wasn't spite, and it wasn't punishment, just a recognition that some conversations end long before the last sentence is spoken. I didn't look back, and I didn't need to. The house went up for sale quietly, the listing tucked between others in the paper, just a line of text and a photo that didn't show the worn step I never got around to fixing. A neighbor mentioned they were moving to the city, something about a new job, a fresh start, and I nodded like I hadn't already heard it from 3 different directions. When the moving truck arrived, I stayed inside, curtains drawn, the kettle already boiling, because watching someone leave a home you built with your hands feels too much like attending your own funeral in reverse. Camille's father eventually called again, this time calmer, asking if I'd consider attending a foundation event he was organizing. "You have a strong story," he said, "and people respond to strength." I declined gently, thanked him for the invitation, and hung up with a feeling that wasn't bitterness, just distance. People like him always come back around when your story becomes convenient, when your resilience makes for good press, but I wasn't interested in performing fortitude. I wanted softness, the kind that doesn't need applause, the kind that waits quietly at the table with soup already warm. One afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Jared. The envelope was plain, my name written in the same messy print he used on birthday cards as a boy. Inside were 3 lines. I don't know how to undo what I did. But I see it now. I do. I read it twice, then placed it in the same box with the others, alongside the unsent letters and old receipts and the photograph of him asleep on my chest the night he came home from the hospital. Some things don't require response, only remembrance, and I had learned how to hold both. At the end of summer, my class held a small ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just tea and cookies and folded certificates printed with names that had dared to start again. When they called mine, I stood up slowly, accepted the paper with both hands, and smiled for the first photograph taken of me in years that didn't include anyone else. It hung later in Rose's hallway, right next to her children's school portraits, and every time I passed it, I thought about locked doors and opened windows, and how sometimes graduating isn't about climbing, but about finally stepping away from what you've outgrown.